Because they know the only way lies can dominate truth is that lies must be constant. Constant. Anytime lies stop, truth surfaces. So in their approach of constant lies to propagandize our people, we must take the approach of constant truth to propagandize our people, but we must be constant. Every child in this country over 8 years old knows about Coca-Cola. Yet Coca-Cola doesn't stop putting up signs or whistling jingles. So we must be as enthusiastic about winning our people over the struggle as Coca-Cola is about selling Cokes.
What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Tony Delerme. Thanks for tuning in to a brand new episode of You Must Learn, where we do the knowledge. DTK is the motto. And on today's episode, this is actually going to be the last closeout episode for this great research paper that was written by William Darity Jr. titled What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. And on today's episode, we're going to be focusing on myth number 7, titled Emulating Successful Minorities Will Close the Racial Wealth Gap. But like always, before we get too deep into the topic, we have to go back to the introduction of this great research paper, because that's going to lay down the foundation of what we're getting ready to discuss so that we can properly understand the topic at hand. The racial wealth gap is large and shows no signs of closing. Recent data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation shows that black households hold less than 7 cents on the dollar compared to white households. The white household living near the poverty line typically has about $18,000 in wealth, while black households in similar economic straits typically have a median wealth near zero. This means in turn that many black families have a negative net worth. At the other end of America's economic spectrum, black households constitute less than 2% of those in the top 1% of the nation's wealth distribution. White households constitute more than 96% of the wealthiest Americans. Moreover, even among the nation's wealthiest households, extreme differences persist on the basis of race. The 99th percentile black family is worth a mere $1.5 million, while the 99th percentile white family is worth over $12 million. This means over 870,000 white families have a net worth above $12 million, while out of the 20 million black families in America, fewer than 380,000 are even worth a single $1 million. By comparison, over 13 million of the total 85 million white families are millionaires or better. Okay, so now that we have the basics settled, let's get deep into this myth that if foundational black Americans would just mimic other model immigrant groups, then that would close the racial wealth gap. Now, that's a complete myth. It's a lie. It's 100% untrue. One of the things that a lot of people don't know, because they just simply don't look into it, is that a lot of these immigrant groups, particularly Asians, that we look at and we say to ourselves, oh, they're so smart, they have such a high emphasis on education, they're so business savvy, and that's why they've achieved all that they've achieved in this country. We speak on them and discuss that as if these groups came here poor and build themselves up to where they are now. And that is a complete lie. It just simply isn't true. And we're going to deconstruct that today. And we have to deconstruct that today in order to blow this notion out the water that these other immigrant groups are model immigrant groups, that if we would mimic them and do like they did, but we can't do like they did because we have not gotten the same type of preferential treatment that they have gotten. Now let's get into it. But before we get into the Asians, I want to start off with the Cuban community, specifically down in Miami, because what I really want to highlight here is how much the government assisted them with policy that was specifically for them to provide them with an economic base to elevate them and get them situated in the United States. It's important to highlight that, because look at how the United States government would do that for them. But when it comes to foundational black Americans, you can't get any type of policy passed for you at all whatsoever that will specifically benefit you. Now let's get into it. Furthermore, this does not take into direct account other structural factors and national policies, including the selectivity of documented immigration and any official support provided for particularly immigrant groups by the state. For example, while the favorable class position and predominantly white phenotype of the initial 1960s arrivals from Cuba has been well documented, there is less attention paid to the role of the Cuban refugee program. By 1994, the program had invested more than $1 billion in successful integration for the community through resettlement resources, housing and educational training, and other programs. Now, the reason I pointed this out to you is to lay out a thread of events that shows that consistently over the years and over the decades, the United States government has consistently showed preferential treatment to other immigrant groups, giving them programs that will lay down an economic foundation for them to land on once they get to the U.S., while simultaneously, systemically locking out foundational Black Americans by way of Jim Crow, redlining, and a host of other government-sanctioned laws that kept foundational Black Americans locked out of generating wealth, I should say. And one thing that should be noted, because you're going to hear this come up again, and pay attention for it when I speak on Koreans, you're going to notice that all of these programs seem to come into place for other immigrant groups directly after the civil rights bills were passed. Once they were passed, all of a sudden, the United States decided to open up its borders, allow just about any and everybody to be able to enter the country, and also on top of that, provide them with an economic floor to stand on so that they can sustain themselves and build themselves up properly. Now let's get into it when it comes to Koreans. For Koreans who have been hailed as a successful immigrant group due to their savvy entrepreneurship, what generally is ignored is the fact that the immigrant community that has come to the United States is a highly selected sample of educated urban middle class. They have been able to provide opportunities for themselves by bringing substantial startup capital with them. Perversely, discrimination against blacks by default assisted Korean entrepreneurs in many U.S. cities where they share urban spaces. In addition, as Tamara Noper notes, institutions played a role in their perceived group-based success. While their own exposure to discrimination in America's labor market has played a role in leading to Korean over-concentration in self-employment, the role of government agencies in actively supporting Korean business development is disregarded far too often. Now, what I want to make sure to point out to you is that whenever you're reading research papers such as this and they're citing certain sources, it's extremely important for you to go back to those sources and read that material that they're pulling from, because you'd be shocked and amazed how much critical information that they're actually leaving out. Now, what they've said here on Koreans is pretty much self-explanatory. Yes, there was a strong selective process in which they're basically taking the best and the brightest of Korea and allowing them to come to the United States and build for themselves here. So basically they're coming here with money already. But you don't understand how deep this actually gets with Koreans here in America, and how this applies really to just about every other immigrant group that comes into this country. So let's get deep into the source material that they were pulling this from, and that paper is called Migration and the Korean Diaspora, a comparative description of 5 cases by In Jin-yoon. The U.S. military involvement in Korea after World War II paved the way for the immigration of large numbers of Korean women and children to the United States during and after the Korean War. The U.S. provided military and economic aid to South Korea to prevent the spread of communism in Asia. The presence of U.S. troops resulted in a sizable number of intermarriages between Korean women and American military servicemen, and from 1950 to 2000, about 100,000 Korean women entered the U.S. as a spouse of American GIs. After the Korean War, the U.S. provided greater economic aid to South Korea to strengthen its economic stability and thus help the country withstand communism. The U.S. also became Korea's primary supplier of capital and technology, as well as its largest overseas market, helping Korea to build an economic infrastructure and the foundation for a free market economy, essential for Korea's continuing economic growth. Starting from the early 1960s, Koreans started export-oriented economic development, and the country's standard of living improved steadily. During this period, higher education expanded rapidly, producing a highly educated urban middle class. Members of this class maintained strong motivations for social and economic upward mobility, but they could not all realize their goals in South Korea because of the nation's limited resources and opportunities. After the U.S. opened its borders to increase international migration in 1965, Koreans began to migrate in search of better economic and educational opportunities. Now, don't let that go over your head. In 1965, after the civil rights bills were passed, all of a sudden the U.S. decides to open up its borders to let everybody come in. Let's carry on. Political and military dominance of the U.S. over South Korea extended to cultural dominance, and between 1945 and 1965, about 6,000 Korean students went to the U.S. to seek higher education at colleges and universities. Many of them settled there after finishing their studies and laid the foundation for future chain migrations from their homeland. The first wave of post-1965 immigrants included a high portion of professionals, particularly medical practitioners. These highly educated and skilled workers were preferentially admitted to the U.S. via occupational visa categories until 1976. As more Korean immigrants became U.S. citizens, they began to sponsor their family members' immigration through family reunification preferences. Now let's really take in what I just read and digest it. After the Korean War, the United States literally rebuilt South Korea to the point to where it was so economically sound that there wasn't enough opportunity for all the professionals that were developing in Korea. So much so to the point that the U.S. opened its borders, particularly to allow the professional class to come into the U.S. and to create an economic foundation for themselves that would then lead to them bringing in their family members in and a chain of other family members in, that when they arrive to the U.S., they already have a sound economic base to stand on. What I'm telling you is that when you're going around Koreatown here in Los Angeles or anywhere else in the country, don't let anybody fill your head with foolishness that these were poor people that came to the United States and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And furthermore, in between 1945 and 1965, Korean students were allowed to come into the United States to pursue higher education. All the while, in that same time period, you couldn't even use the bathroom next to white people. You literally couldn't take a dump next to the white man. In between that same time period that the U.S. government had allowed 6,000 Korean students to come in to pursue higher education. And furthermore, the same can be said for those of the Arabic nations that come into the United States. These are not the poor peasants of Iran and Iraq and so on and so forth who come into this country and put liquor stores on the corner in your community. That's not the poor that came here from these countries and pulled themselves up by their bootstrap to do that. Those were already financially successful, financially secured, upper class Arabic people that have come here to the United States in a highly selective process that only allows the best of the best to come in here, and then when they come in here with a substantial amount of capital, they build their liquor stores and their corner stores in your community. But understand, once again, these were not the peasant classes that came into the country. Whether you're talking about Asians or Middle Easterns, there's a highly selective process in which they are only letting in the upper class, the professional class, or upper middle class to come into the country. And just to be plain and simple, they already got cash on deck when they get here. Money's already in pocket, ready to go to set up shop as soon as they touch down in the States. But they tell you, why can't you be like them and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps? Because they didn't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They had money when they got here. Now what I want to do is close this segment out by giving you one more example to officially put this myth to bed, that if black folks would just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and imitate model immigrant groups, then that would close the racial wealth gap. There is no other or greater example to use than that of current Hispanics that are in the country today. Now if we're just going to go off of the stereotypes, Hispanics work very hard, correct? And statistically speaking, there are more Hispanics in the country than there are black people. So there's more more of them than us here, and they've also been here for a substantial amount of time, on top of the fact that they all work very hard, and we do live in this post-racial era of the United States, where Martin Luther King waved his magic wand, he said, "I have a dream," and ever since then, everything has been even Steven. So if that's the case, granted how hard Hispanics work, and that there are more of them here than us, and they've been here for a substantial period of time, why is it that to this day they are equally as poor as foundational Black Americans are? That's the question. And the reason for that being is this, and it's what we've been talking about throughout the course of the last 3 weeks when it comes to closing the racial wealth gap. If you're coming here with poverty, as they do, and there is no economic base for them to stand on, then you're coming into a situation in which white society owns 90 or holds 90% of the nation's wealth. You're coming in poor. There's no more wealth to go around. So all you can do is stay poor collectively as a group. White people hold 90% of the nation's wealth. Unless Hispanics are coming in with an economic foundation in place, as was the case for Asians and as was the case for particularly Cubans, unless you're coming into this situation here in the United States with an economic foundation in place for you when you get here, if you're coming here poor, you will stay poor. That's the point that I'm trying to drive to you here. Because we live in this post-racial America, right? And they work really hard. So if that's the case, they shouldn't be as poor as we stupid blacks are. Because we're dumb, lazy, stupid, ignorant. We don't want to work. We just want to be on welfare, drink 40 ounces, and commit black on black crime. That's what's told about us. Am I not correct? So if they're the polar opposites, they should be at a higher, elevated economic status. But they're not. You can't come here poor and expect to rise up to a higher economic status when you're coming here poor, playing on an uneven playing field in which 90% of the nation's wealth is locked up in white society. It doesn't work that way. And that's why we maintain in the position that we are in as well. And I've been driving that point to you, like I said, for the last 3 to 4 weeks. Now, it's important to note this, though. When it comes down to the poverty between Hispanics and between whites, if I haven't said this before, I'm going to say it again because it's very important to point out these are 2 different types of poverty. You're talking about, on one hand, poverty from blacks due to 350 years of being systemically locked out of being able to generate wealth, versus Hispanics coming into the country, bringing poverty with them and remaining impoverished. It's important to maintain or to point out that distinction between the 2 types of poverty that exist and why it exists. But it's also important to point out the fact that as we speak now here in the United States, with white America having 90% of the nation's wealth locked into their society, that poverty begets poverty and wealth begets wealth. Just like you have generational wealth, you have generational poverty as well. And Hispanics prove that point. So there's no amount of bootstrap pulling that you can do that will elevate your people as a whole to a higher economic standard unless there are tangibles attached to political policies or to policies that are aimed specifically for your group of people in order to economically elevate themselves. As individuals, random individuals on the board, yeah, here and there, you'll have people rise up and do really well. But as a group, as a whole, without reparations, sadly to say, it's just not possible. The wealth is already calcified and locked in, and it's not going anywhere. So with all that being said, I'm your boy Tony Delerme. I ain't got no more talking. Make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell notification next to the subscribe button so you can be notified whenever I drop a new video. And like I always say, make sure you do me the biggest favor by texting tdhiphop to number 33222. That's tdhiphop to number 33222, so that way you can get a direct text notification whenever I drop a new video. And also, if you want to help on a financial level with the advertising fund, you can hit me up on Cash App. That's $tdhiphop. And if you don't have Cash App on your phone, you can hit the link in the description below, and you can donate whatever amount you'd like to the advertising fund, and you pay for that in the same way that you pay for anything else online. So with all that being said, I'm your boy Tony Delerme. I ain't got no more talking. I'm out of here, man. Deuces.